All right, moving on to elastic tissue. It's referred to as elastic tissue because it has an abundant supply of elastic fibers. These are found in blood vessels that have elasticity, like the larger arteries that we'll talk about when we do the cardiovascular system, in our respiratory passages when we do the respiratory system, and within the vertebral column, specifically within some of the structures that help cushion and support the vertebral column. Oh, sorry. What I was going to say is that in a histological slide, so this is a diagram, this is supposed to be a histological micrograph, a picture. Usually the elastic fibers are fairly visible, not quite as obvious as reticular connective tissue, but with elastic tissue, often the elastic fibers are visible, especially if it's a blood vessel. Okay, so general locations and functions to know. And then dense irregular connective tissue. One of the ways I describe this is if you think of dense regular connective tissue, the collagen fibers are all in parallel, kind of one direction. With dense irregular connective tissue, the collagen fibers are in multiple directions, different directions, almost like if it's been put in a blender and everything's been twisted and turned around. So the fibers are all kind of interwoven in different directions. A lot of collagen fibers, it's very abundant, and this tissue is found in joint capsules, the capsules that surround our joints, perichondrium, which surrounds cartilage, periosteum, which surrounds bone. So we will look at this tissue again when we do the skeletal system and joints. Down in the dermis, this deeper layer of our skin. So we'll revisit this tissue when we look at the integumentary system in our next chapter, and in the tough capsules that surround some organs in the body. Okay. What else was I going to say here? That's it, I guess. So here's locations and functions. Okay. Fluid connective tissues. So this is our blood, and the matrix of blood is the extracellular matrix, which is what we call plasma. So it's a unique connective tissue in which the matrix is actually a fluid, as opposed to kind of being semi-solid. So the blood part is the vascular connective tissue, red blood cells carrying oxygen, white blood cells, part of our immune system, and then platelets, which are involved in the blood clotting cascade. And then there's also lymph, which is lymph connective tissue. This is leaked plasma at the capillary beds that's picked up by the lymphatic system and eventually returned back to the bloodstream. And we'll cover that in detail when we do the lymphatic system. Here's a simple diagram that shows how the lymphatic system in green is associated with the cardiovascular system here in red and blue. At the capillary beds where oxygen and nutrients are delivered to the tissues and the cells, plasma leaks out as well, because the capillary beds, as we'll see in the capillaries, are leaky. And that leaked fluid, which is now extracellular fluid, gets picked up by the lymphatic capillaries, and once it's in the lymphatic capillaries and vessels, it's referred to as lymph, this liquid, and eventually it's returned to the blood supply. Supporting connective tissues. Cartilage. Think of the cartilage at the end of your joints at long bones. The matrix is fairly firm, kind of rubbery. It is comprised of primarily chondroitin sulfates. It is avascular, has no blood supply, so it's kind of a unique connective tissue. One reason why cartilage damage heals very slowly is because it's avascular. The chondrocytes, the cells of cartilage, are called chondrocytes. Chondro for cartilage, cyte for cell, and the cartilaginous cells, the chondrocytes, secrete the extracellular matrix, which is semi-solid, firm, and in doing so, the chondrocytes are encased in cartilage, and the chondrocytes are found in a little cavity, a little space within the cartilage, and that space is called the lacuna. So the chondrocytes reside or are found within the lacunae, within cartilage. We'll see a similar situation with bone. There's usually a surrounding connective tissue structure called the perichondrium. Right? Peri meaning around, chondrium, the cartilage. It helps give the cartilage some structural integrity. Locations between the tips of long bones at your joints. Synovial joints also forms part of your larynx, your voice box. The cartilaginous rings of your trachea, your windpipe. The nasal septum, right, the rubbery part of your nose. Functions, right, provides support, but it's yet flexible, reduces friction between joints. So, hyaline cartilage, of the cartilages, specifically the hyaline cartilage, it's the most common type, found between the joints, ribs, sternums, in the respiratory passages. Right? This is the same figure as the previous slides. And articular cartilage, articulation means joint. So it's the type of cartilage found in our joints, like the joints of the long bones. Think of your fingers, right? Your elbow joint, protecting the movement between the bones. That's articular hyaline cartilage. There's elastic cartilage. So it's a similar type structure. The chondrocytes are found in the lacuna. The chondrocytes secrete the extracellular matrix. The ground substance is the cartilage, but the fibers in this case, there's an abundance of elastic fibers, which makes this type of cartilage very elastic, rubbery in a way. You find it in your ears. That's why your ears, they're pretty flexible, but they bounce back to the original shape. And also in like your epiglottis that we'll look at when we do the respiratory and the digestive system. Okay? And then fibrous cartilage, also called fibrocartilage. Similar structure in the sense that there are chondrocytes within lacunae. They secrete the extracellular matrix. Excuse me. A superabundant amount of collagen that gives this type of cartilage high strength. And it's found in our intervertebral discs. Where's my cursor? It likes to go to sleep. So the intervertebral discs have to be very strong to support the stress and the pounding of our vertebral column, supporting our body and our weight. Excuse me. So in the intervertebral discs, you'll find a lot of fibrocartilage, fibrous cartilage, and also in the pubic symphysis, that joint at the front end of our pelvic girdle. And we'll talk about those two things when we do the skeletal system. Okay, continuing. Bone, also called osseous tissue, osseo for bone. The cells are called osteocytes, should be noted here, right? Osteocytes, also in their little spaces called lacunae. The extracellular matrix in this case is solid bone. So there's a lot of collagen fibers, and the ground substance gets infused with calcium salts, primarily calcium phosphate, which gives bone a lot of strength, but also some flexibility. The strength, compression strength, is primarily the calcium salts. The flexibility is due primarily to the collagen fibers. So all this material is in the extracellular matrix surrounding the osteocytes within their little spaces, the lacunae. The osteocytes are found in lacunae. They're connected to each other by little canals, passageways through the solid bone that are called canaliculi. And on a slide, a micrograph picture, the canaliculi look like these little cracks. I often refer to them their appearance as cracks in ice. And they are the connections between the individual osteocytes within their lacunae, and ultimately the connection to what's called the central canal, which is the blood supply. There's spongy and compact bone. Spongy bone is what you see here. It kind of looks somewhat like a sponge in a way, but it's not soft. It is solid, but it has a lot of open cavities and spaces between what are called the trabeculae, these struts. Compact bone is compact. There's no gaps in between it, and it's very strong. And again, we'll talk about this in much more detail when we do the skeletal system a little later on. Okay, let's look at membranes. So membranes within the body, it has, or they have, an epithelial tissue and an underlying connective tissue. As you see here, in purple, an epithelial tissue and underneath connective tissue. Notice it's only cellular epithelial tissue, and this looks like what? Simple columnar epithelium. Happens to be ciliated, and underneath it there's the basement membrane, so underneath it is something different, connective tissue, with blood vessels. Connective tissue is typically vascular, epithelium is avascular. So here's a thin epithelium, connective tissue underneath, a thicker epithelium, connective tissue underneath, and in our joints, the synovial membrane, a really thin epithelium, it's actually not even intact, and an underlying connective tissue. So with a membrane, there's an epithelial tissue and a connective tissue. So a mucous membrane, or a mucosa, these line the cavities open to the exterior. Think of inside your mouth or inside your nose. Simple columnar epithelium of the digestive tract, for example. Stratified squamous epithelium in the oral cavity, and stratified there to give extra protection. Think of, chewing up tortilla chips, which are abrasive. And then in the urinary system, remember there's a transitional epithelium, but there's an underlying connective tissue. And mucosa, because they are wet, moist, because there are glands that secrete usually mucus. Oh, here we go, zooming into this figure. This is a particular cell that's modified to secrete a material, in this case mucus, and this would be a goblet cell. A serous membrane, or a serosa, this is a membrane that is not open to the exterior environment. This is internal to the cavity. This is internal within the body, within bodily cavities. And they have two layers, a visceral and a parietal layer. And we introduced this in a previous chapter. For example, what's called the mesothelium of the pleurae surrounding the lungs, or the peritoneum surrounding the heart. Peritoneum surrounding the digestive organs in the abdominal cavity. And the pericardium, which surrounds the heart, right? Cardium for heart. So a very thin epithelium, a mesothelium, and underlying connective tissue, areolar in this case, and the transudate is the material that's secreted by the epithelium. That's a lubricating fluid. And we'll revisit these when we do the respiratory system, digestive system, and cardiovascular system. And then a cutaneous membrane, our skin, it's dry, exposed to the environment. It is a stratified squamous epithelium, and since it's dry, it's keratinized to reduce water loss. And underlying connective tissue, the top portion of the underlying connective tissue is areolar connective tissue. Here we go. As we transition to the deeper connective tissue, it is dense irregular connective tissue. And we'll see this again when we do the integumentary system next chapter. And then the synovial membrane, incomplete epithelium, as I mentioned, with an underlying areolar connective tissue.